Welcome everyone to our first book talk of the academic year. I am so excited to be in conversation with Bettye Kearse, who's the author of The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. Before we get to our discussion with Dr. Kearse, I want to just welcome you to this program, to also let you know a little something about the Library Company of Philadelphia's program in African-American history. We are now over a decade old, going into that second decade, and we're the anchor program for the Library Company of Philadelphia. We are so pleased that we're able to bring you wonderful programming in every aspect of early America. And so I'd also like to thank the Assistant Director of the program in African-American history, Jasmine Smith, for her help in organizing this. And also on our tech end, we have my wonderful colleague, Tristan Dan, who is working the background. So I am Deirdre Cooper Owens. I'm the director of the program in African-American history, and I can't wait because this is more than just a book talk. You'll also be able to see a film that highlights Dr. Kearse's work about the other Madisons. Hopefully, there's been a bit of some technical difficulty, so we're hoping that we'll have the filmmaker who will be able to join us, Eduardo Montes-Bradley. I'm first going to introduce our speaker. So Bettye Kearse is a writer and retired pediatrician living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Her essays, commentaries, and personal narratives have appeared in the anthology Black Lives Have Always Mattered, they have, the Boston Herald, Mental Floss, Time Magazine, the New York Times, and other national publications. Dr. Kearse is a descendant of an enslaved woman and President James Madison. In March 2020, Mifflin Harcourt published her memoir, The Other Madisons, The Lost History of a President's Black Family. In this deeply personal memoir, Dr. Kearse reveals the obstacles, internal and external, she confronted while becoming her family's oral historian, one determined to tell the whole story. We also have Eduardo Montes-Bradley, who's the filmmaker. He's an independent artist. He has produced and directed over 40 biographical portrayals of distinguished artists and intellectuals, including Rita Dove, Jorge Luis Borges, Julian Bond, and Alice Parker. Other relevant works in his prolific career as a filmmaker are Samba, On Your Feet, a unique approach to Afro-Brazilian cultural traditions through music and the evolution of Carnival. Eduardo's Che, Rise and Fall was released by National Geographic, and it's been embraced by the critics as, and I quote, one of the most relevant accounts of the life of the legendary Che Guevara. On the same path of historical figures, he produced and directed Monroe Hill, a biographical approach to the life of James Monroe in times of the French Revolution, deserving of an award by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and Evita, a 1-hour in-depth portrayal of the woman and the myth behind Argentina's influential First Lady. In addition, Montes-Bradley has collaborated creating award-winning photo exhibits and documentaries for the University of Virginia, Museo de Bellas Artes, UNESCO, Ish Tatan Foundation, University of Virginia, James Madison's Montpelier, and the Ron Brown Foundation. Montes-Bradley resides in Charlottesville and is currently working on Black Fiddlers, a documentary about the African experience on the birth of American folk music. I'd also like to extend a welcome on behalf of the Library Company's director, Michael Bersanti, and say a welcome to all of our trustees and board members, our shareholders who might be in the audience. So without further ado, Dr. Kearse, the platform is all yours.
Thank you, Deirdre. Let me get up my slides. All right, can you see those? Well,
Yes.
okay. Well, thank you very much, Deirdre. I've been looking forward to this. During the next 20 minutes or so, I am going to share with you how I came to write The Other Madisons, introduce you to my 5 greats grandmother, Mandy, and take you with me on my quest to find her. So let's go in search of Mandy, the other Madison's first griot. Griot's women and griot's men carry forth the stories of their ancestors. For thousands of years, generations of West African griots and griots have served as human links between past and present by speaking the stories of their ancestors and the history of their people. And when Africans were kidnapped and enslaved, they did not leave their tradition of oral history behind. Without it, I would not know that I am a descendant of the enslaved cook Corinne and her enslaver and half-brother, President James Madison. The oral history of my family says that James Madison Jr., a founding father of our nation, was also a founding father of my African-American family. For more than 200 years, our family credo, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president, has been a source of inspiration and pride, but it started as a mere tool. According to the history told by the 8 generations of my family's American griots and griots, James Madison Jr. became attracted to his half-sister Corinne. And around 1794, the result of that attraction was the birth of a son, my great, great, great grandfather, Jim. Shortly after the War of 1812, the president's wife, Dolly, sold Jim. As he was being taken away, Corinne pleaded with Jim, always remember, you're a Madison. She believed the name could help them find each other someday, yet they never saw each other again. But Jim remembered his mother's words and passed them on to his children and told them to tell their children that they are Madisons. Over the generations, as America changed, the credo changed. And in the film that you will see a little later, you will learn just how it changed and why. In 1990, when my mother, our 7th generation griot, turned over to me the old cardboard box of family memorabilia, I became the 8th generation griot. When I asked her why now, she answered, I want to give you plenty of time to write the book. I can probably write a book about our history, I thought, but I cannot be the one to hold up the torch of family pride. For many years, I had wondered why, or even whether, the credo should make me proud. For me, it echoed with the abuses of slavery. I decided to confront those abuses. Now, you've just heard about Corinne, the enslaved woman who started the credo. But the story started with Corinne's mother, a stolen woman called Mandy. Mandy told Corinne, who told Jim, who told my great-great-grandfather Emmanuel, who told my great-grandfather Mac, who told my beloved Gramps, who told my mother, who told me, who tells her children, my grandchildren, Peter and Madison, that she, Mandy, was stolen from the shores near her village in Ghana, carried across the ocean in the bowels of a wretched ship, shoved onto an auction block, sold, forced to work in a small cotton field on a remote corner of a huge tobacco plantation, and then raped by her enslaver, James Madison Sr. Corinne was born of those forced encounter, thus making her and the future president half siblings. They had the same father. So the abuses inherent in the credo include rape and incest. But that felt like just part of the message. Mandy held the rest. In 1992, I began my journey of discovery of my ancestors, our country, and myself. I traveled to Lagos, Portugal, where the transatlantic slave trade began, to Ghana, West Africa, where Mandy was born, to Baltimore, Maryland, where a replica of a slave ship like the one that carried Mandy away from home sits in a museum, to Central Texas, where my great-great-grandparents and their 8 sons learned that they were free, and to New York City, where an 18th century African burial ground had recently been discovered. But my journeys began and ended at Montpelier, James Madison's former plantation in Virginia, where Mandy labored and died. From the moment I first set foot on the soil where my ancestors had walked some 200 years earlier, I felt that I belonged there with them and that they and this place would reveal what the credo was saying to me. I started out on a guided tour, but I asked so many questions about slavery on the plantation that the guide directed me to Lynn Lewis, the chief archaeologist. When I told her my family's history, she took me to the rear of the mansion and pointed out a path of bare soil about 3 inches deep and a foot or so wide that ran between the rear entry of the mansion and an excavation site about 70 feet away. When we reached the site, Lynn knelt down and folded back a tarp. Beneath it lay a rectangle of bricks. And Lynn explained that this used to be the kitchen and that the path had been worn into the ground by generations of enslaved cooks walking to and from the mansion, serving the Madisons and their many guests. I stepped into the furrow and followed the length of it. My eyes teared. I had not expected to walk so literally in the footsteps of an ancestor. And seeing where the kitchen had stood and recalling the stories I knew so well, I felt the tears flow. This might have been where James Madison Jr. first saw Corinne, and where not far away, she stood helpless while Dolly sent Jim away. The visit was taking its toll on me, but I said to Lynn, I really should see where my enslaved ancestors are buried. Lynn said in her Texas drawl, not a good idea. The grave sites don't have any names or dates on them. And besides, I would not recommend you go there in those shorts and sandals. There's lots of poison ivy. Overwhelmed and tired by being in the same place where 3 of my ancestors had been held in bondage, 2 of them raped, and 1 sold, I was relieved not to go. Next time, I promised. Next time. 3 years later, I was in Ghana, West Africa. Chapter 9 of the Other Madisons begins with my favorite sentence in the whole book. Let me read a portion of that sentence, read the whole sentence and a portion of that chapter to you. The chapter is called The Castle. The blue of the African sky was the most perfect color God ever made. Beneath it, the ocean was blue too. And when I ventured into the water, it curled over my feet. Then stepping back onto the dry sand, I turned to watch the water gather up my wet footprints, taking them into the ocean's depths, disappearing westward as others had gone. It was 1995, and my aim was to trace Mandy's footsteps from Africa to America. I stood on the shore and looked up at Elmina Castle. Built by the Portuguese in 1482, it stretched along the shoreline and rose out of the rocks like a white crown. Beautiful in spite of its history. In the central courtyard, I joined a group of visitors from distant parts of the world and were surprised when our guide explained that the square building at the center of the courtyard was a church, the first Catholic church in sub-Saharan Africa. But when the Protestant Dutch took over in 1637, they used the church to buy and sell goods and slaves. At one end of the courtyard, there had been a balcony. There had been a courtyard that had been a holding area for female captives. Our guide pointed up to the balcony and told us of a tradition at Elmina. When the Dutch governor wanted a woman, he ordered his soldiers to bring a group of captives to the area of the courtyard below his living quarters. Then he stepped onto the balcony, surveyed the women below, and pointed to the one he wanted. Finally, the guards pushed and prodded the ill-fated woman up a narrow stairway and through a trap door that opened directly into the governor's bedroom above. The trap door was then closed and locked. I stood looking up at the balcony, and I felt Mandy's presence nearby. She was terrified by the governor's gaze. When the time came to board the ship, the women who had survived the beating, starvation, and rape were goaded through a series of tunnels until they reached a room that offered the only sunlight many had seen for weeks. Blinded by the light, the women, Mandy among them, entered a narrow gated egress and out to the beach. They had walked through, stumbled through, crawled through, or fallen through the gate of no return. Beyond it, they could feel something familiar under their feet, African sand. But only moments later, that sensation was lost forever. The ocean wiped away their footprints. When I returned to Montpelier 5 years after my first visit, Lynn Lewis was at an excavation site, so I waited on the front portico. The April sky was clear and blue, and the sun was just beginning to warm the morning air. The distant, densely forested mountains were clear, almost purple, and so wide they wrapped around the horizon. Spring here, I thought, was alluring with its promise of warmth and sense of awakening. But Montpelier had been a prison. Once, scores of slave cabins lay south of the mansion, and I pictured enslaved people diminutive in the distant fields, toiling, their labor coaxing riches from the soil, making possible the Madison legacy. Lynn joined me, and as we walked toward the slave cemetery, I grew more and more afraid I would see an isolated patch of dry dirt riddled with poison ivy, a place where enslaved people in death, as in life, had been dishonored. As we approached a low hill that rose behind a cluster of trees, Lynn stopped and said, "This is it." The field of bright blue periwinkles took me by surprise. We stepped off the graveled road and entered a small woods. Blanketed with fallen leaves and cradling the hidden manes, the earth was soft underfoot. "It's because of these periwinkles," Lynn said, "that we know this is burial ground. Back then, folks in the South planted them to pretty up cemeteries. Under the leaves, we found linear depressions, all situated east to west, where the ground had sunk a little. Then last winter, there was an early thaw, and the only snow left was in the depressions. It was eerie and very beautiful." Lynn guided me further in. Careful we did not kick the headstones and footstones, crude blocks of white quartz. We stood in a kingdom of many trees, but only one of them called to me. I approached it, reverent. Nestled at the base was a stone the color of raw flesh, its uneven surface shiny and smooth. I knelt down and touched the rock, imagining my ancestor Mandy lying beneath. The gentle morning sun was warm on my back, and my shadow fell over the rock, uniting me with my family's first matriarch, my 5 greats grandmother. Mandy's hands sowed and reaped the riches of the Southern soil for someone else. Mandy's womb gave birth to generations of descendants, her own legacy. And Mandy's heart gave those descendants the ability to believe in themselves. In the 7 years since receiving the box from my mother, I had struggled to understand why or even whether the credo should make me proud. I will always remember that I am a Madison and that I come from a president. But it is Mandy, and a stolen and enslaved woman, who is my inspiration. It is Mandy who makes me proud. And I believe that through the book I have written, I found a way to make the world pay attention to Mandy. I looked up from the stone and I said to Lynn, with absolute confidence, I have found Mandy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kearse. I feel as if we should have a moment of silence in memory of Mandy and all of your ancestors and all of those who remain unknown in the historical record as well. This was quite moving, quite moving. I am now, unfortunately, it seems as if Eduardo is not able, our filmmaker is not able to join us, but I would love for you, Dr. Kearse, to just kind of maybe do an intro before we go to the 20-minute film. And most certainly I have questions. I come from a mother who has done extensive genealogy on our family that goes back to the colonial period as well. So I have personal questions, but I see hands being raised in the audience. And so we will take questions. I will direct you to ask those questions in the Q&A function. If you can't do that, then in the chat is fine as well. But I am going to allow Dr. Kearse at this moment to introduce the film and also her work with Eduardo.
All right. I met Eduardo at Montpelier a number of times. He and I both attended some of the Juneteenth celebrations, and he is one of their official photographers. But the most time I spent with him was in the spring of 2017, sorry to call it the year, while we were working on getting films, photographs done for a permanent exhibit that was due to open in the summer of 2017 at Montpelier. And the name of the exhibit, a permanent exhibit, is called The Mere Distinction of Color, which is based on a quote from James Madison and talking about the enslaved people. And the purpose of this exhibit is to demonstrate how important enslaved people were at Montpelier and in James Madison's life, but also how important they were to the country. So I am actually part of this. I'm very proud to be part of this exhibit. My voice and image are in it. And so Eduardo was taking pictures of me, and he took what seemed like thousands, but over the, it was like a half day. Over the day, we got to know each other pretty well. And then 3 years later, after my book came out in 2020, I get an email from Eduardo that says, oh, I see him coming on. So do you want to make a movie? And, being a California girl, where movies are certainly made and very popular, I said, of course. I saw my one and only opportunity to be a movie star. So I said yes. And he ended up coming out to Santa Fe to film me. And so I guess, I don't know if Eduardo wants to say a few words now, or if we want to show the film and then have Eduardo speak later.
Yeah, Eduardo, welcome. This is Deirdre Cooper Owens. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here, and it's actually perfect because if you're able to, you can introduce your film.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm in New York on location of a film that we're doing called Black Fiddlers, and for some reason I wasn't not able to log in before. I just want to say that I'm honored to be here and to be to support Bettye once again in this extraordinary saga that began long ago when she got this mandate from her mother to write a book. And then I was fortunate enough to be chosen by her and she by me was a match made in heaven to produce this film, and that I'm of which I'm extremely proud.
That's great. Thank you so much. And I can see that you're on location as well.
Yes. I got a photographer here.
I see. All right. So without further ado, Tristan, I'm going to ask that you play the film now.
Can you?
The first horn lifts its arm over the dew-lit grass, and in the slave quarters there is a rustling. Children are bundled into aprons, cornbread and water gourds grabbed, a salt pork breakfast taken. I watch them driven into the vague before dawn while their mistress sleeps like an ivory toothpick and Massa dreams of asses, rum, and slave funk. I cannot fall asleep again. At the second horn, the whip curls across the backs of the laggards, sometimes my sister's voice, unmistaken, among them. "Oh, pray," she cries, "oh, pray." Those days I lie on my cot, shivering in the early heat, and as the fields unfold to whiteness and they spill like bees among the fat flowers, I weep. It is not yet daylight.
Well, there's quite a story about my family, where they came from. And actually, we did not start out in Oakland. And my family started out in Ghana, West Africa, if we want to go back to the first of our ancestors in this country. And her name was Mandy. And Mandy was a young woman when she was captured from the shore near her village when she was alone. And so an amazing part of our family story, and probably many other African American family stories, is that they survived the Middle Passage. And then they had to survive the breaking in period, not just physically, but also emotionally, as they had to adapt to becoming an enslaved person where they had been free in Africa. Often when I would get fidgety, especially while she was trying to get me to stand still as she made fancy dresses for my piano recitals, my mother would bring out the box of family memorabilia and pull out items and tell me stories. Even before she started telling the stories, she would admonish me with our family credo, which has guided us for some 200 years. She would say, "Always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president." By repeating the credo at such times, she was telling me how proud she was of our ancestors, both white and black. But she was also letting me know how she was expecting me to behave. And the reasons were supported by those family stories that she was getting ready to tell me.
They can't tell you the name of the ship their ancestors came over on. They can't tell you the name of the village they were taken from. They probably can't tell you the names of the plantations that their families worked on, unless those plantations somehow, survived into their oral history, because that's how so much of these families' stories have been preserved, is through the oral tradition that they've passed down from family member to family member. And that's what Bettye's doing. She's the griot. She's the caretaker of her family's history.
According to the griot and griot tradition of my family, after Mandy was sold, she came to James Madison Sr.'s plantation.
When Mandy was purchased, probably in Fredericksburg, that would have been the closest slave market that James Madison Sr. was frequenting, I imagine. When Mandy was purchased, she would have been put in a wagon, potentially with other people. We don't have any records of when she might have come to the plantation, or whether it was by herself or with a group of other people. But we certainly know that Madison Sr. was buying enslaved people through the 1740s, 50s, 60s.
Glory to the Lamb. Hallelujah. I am staying bound for the promised land.
And also, according to the family oral tradition, Mandy was put in a remote cotton field so that she would be away from most of the activity of this huge tobacco plantation. And it was there that James Madison Sr. first saw her and became attracted to her. And the way the story is told is that he became attracted to her because she could pick cotton so fast.
when she arrived at the plantation, think about the culture shock that would have been for her. Here's like, you know, probably the biggest house in the county is Madison's home. It's this massive brick mansion, much different than anything she's seen. Fields and fields of tobacco and corn, wheat, blacksmith operation, the forges pounding away. How different would that have been from her village in Ghana, in the Bight of Benin? There's actually a real similarity in the geography of Virginia and those countries that lie in the Bight, and there's a similarity between the forest and between the rolling hills and between the red clay soil that exists in both places. But you know, the difference between her village and this plantation would have been immense. And of course, the biggest difference is that she was totally under the thumb of the person who owned her. And she went from living a life of complete freedom to a life with none. And she was about to find out just how little freedom and how little choice she would have.
I don't know exactly what happened. And I don't know whether or not there was assault, any form of violence, or if it was coercion, you know, an effort to survive, an effort not to be punished in some sort of way, beaten, starved, or sold away. She was among the most vulnerable human beings in the world, and James Madison Sr. was among the most powerful human beings in the world. Wealthy, well-established Virginia planter. He had power. James Madison Sr.'s attention, the attention that he paid to her led to the birth of a daughter whose name was Corinne. Corinne initially started picking cotton as a young girl, but later she was chosen to work in the kitchen.
So the Madisons had two kitchens underneath their duplex, their historic duplex, but they also had a kitchen outside, which I hear Montpelier is reconstructing, which is fantastic. And kitchens were typically moved outside. It started happening in these larger plantation homes right about the time where a lot of the enslaved were coming over and replacing the labor of the indentured white laborers. And so when you see the influx and the rise of enslaved Africans coming into the colony, and you see a decline of the white indentured servants, you see a separation of space within those homes. And the kitchens then began moving outside, not for fear of fire or heat. It was because of the need to sort of differentiate space and race during this period. Corinne, as an enslaved chef at a prominent house in Virginia, would have had different treatment than some of the folks in the field. And of course, this depended on the plantation that you were on. But typically, if you were an enslaved cook working inside of that house, you would have more power than anybody else. You know, you were able to poison the person that enslaved you. And there's been several cases of enslaved cooks poisoning their enslaver, and whether it was intentional or they just left the food out too long is still sort of left to be determined. But that power that they had was something that was very much unique to the enslaved chef.
Well, I think the connection I have to the my enslaved ancestors began to become stronger during the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And I mean, I think the whole country, especially the African American communities throughout the country, became more and more aware of their African roots. We were wearing dashikis and afros and shouting Black Power. It was a very unique time.
Oh, freedom over me.
And I think just now we're beginning to become more and more aware of the contributions that the enslaved people made. Many of us are becoming able to take pride in our ancestors, our enslaved ancestors. And I think that we're beginning to recognize that enslaved people had remarkable inner strength and a sense of hope. Otherwise, they would not have been able to survive.
Mandy worked based on Bettye's oral history that she's preserved and has been passed down through the family is in the kitchen. And the kitchen at Montpelier, the main kitchen throughout the 18th and early 19th century into the 1820s at least. And that's the area we've done archaeology on over the past decade and actually reconstructed the buildings. And in fact, the South Kitchen is what we call it. The South Kitchen today is literally being rebuilt from the ground right now.
So historic sites and plantations that interpret slavery have really come a long way. I think that it is incredibly important, though, visitors be able to empathize to some kind of degree about what it must have been like. Something about what it might have been like to live every day with the knowledge that your loved one could be sold and that you would never see them again. I also think that it is important to reconstruct slave dwellings based on really careful study and analysis and archaeological excavation. Because for a person to be able to walk into a space and feel that space in relationship to their own bodies, that is so much more impactful than just, reading about it.
And I'm glancing over here at the excavation of the kitchen. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually able to look at where she worked and just see the surrounding area and see some of the same things that she once saw. From the moment I told her my family's story, she was excited by it. And they had just discovered this kitchen, and she said, "You're an outsider, but I'm going to show you something special." And she took me to see the foundation of the kitchen, which was just sort of a rectangle of bricks with a pile of more bricks at one end, which was the cooking hearth. And she pulled back some of the blue tarp that was there. And, so I was able to see something real. And what else was real was at that time, there was a groove in the ground that led from the kitchen to the back of the mansion that had been worn there by generations of slaves walking to and from the kitchen to serve the Madisons. And I was able to actually walk in that groove. So I was literally able to walk in my own ancestors' footsteps.
It's incredible.
Yeah, that was an incredible experience.
My friend, I want to call your attention to the 8th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke and the 22nd verse. It came to pass on the certain day that he went out into a ship with his disciples and said unto them, let us go over on the other side of the lake. And they launched forth. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And there came down a storm, a wind on the lake, and they were filled with water.
African Americans from the time of slavery through right now have made major contributions, to this country. And James Madison in particular, without the luxuries that slave labor offered him, he would not have been able to go off to the College of New Jersey or whatever they called Princeton at that time and learn about the great political philosophers to formulate the ideas that are the basis for the United States Constitution. And without that Constitution, this nation would have failed. Well, I imagine her as beautiful, with rich, dark skin, perfect, smooth, beautiful skin. I imagine her body as being kind of sinewy and strong. And I imagine her having lots of red beads in her hair before she came to America and ended up with just one bead in her hair that she cherished for the rest of her life. Baptized with the Holy Ghost, my life it pure and clean. For Jesus reign within.
For the past 20 years, since May of 2000, I've been the director of archaeology at Montpelier. And pretty much from the day I arrived at Montpelier, been interested in seeing how archaeology can bear witness to the enslaved ancestors of the larger Montpelier descendant community. With the material remains, the household broken items, the pottery, the ceramics, sometimes even bits of cufflinks and clothing that were left behind by the ancestors of Montpelier descendants. And with working with the descendant community, like with Bettye, all of a sudden these pieces, these fragments of the past come to life, because to work with descendants and you're finding their ancestor remains, the material remains from their households. And in some cases, you're not finding them as archaeologists, you're working with the descendants who are finding them themselves. They're the ones who are holding them in their hands. It is just mind-blowing, to be able to witness that and to connect the descendants with their ancestors past. And all of a sudden, you're helping to make their ancestors, who they don't know necessarily, in some cases Bettye does, but in other cases they don't know their names and certainly don't have photographs. All of a sudden you're able to make their ancestors real.
Just like the light of gold.
I'm a little bit ambivalent about my pride. Madison was a flawed human being, as we all are, but he did great things for the country. So that's where the pride is.
So as Corinne is growing up on the plantation at Montpelier, there are the Madison children who are coming of age at the same time, and so you have these adolescent young men who are on a plantation pretty far from any town of any significant size. There are other plantations around with other plantation owners' children around, but you have a handful of adolescent boys who are going to want to be adolescent boys. And as the plantation owner, a man in the 18th century is going to encourage his sons to let boys be boys. And of course, you don't want a pregnancy out of wedlock with a plantation owner's daughter. You certainly don't want your son potentially marrying down, if you will. So you would encourage them to practice, as it were, on the enslaved population, because after all, they were your property and they didn't have any choice in the matter. And the result of that behavior was an investment for the Madison family, right? So as enslaved women had children who were of mixed parentage, those babies were valuable enslaved property. And the lighter the skin, the more valuable the enslaved person. As the 19th century wore on and people began to be sold south into the deep south, as the soil plays out in Virginia and tobacco is no longer quite the cash crop that it was, what you find is Virginia becomes sort of the cradle for the deep south, and all of these enslaved children in Virginia are being sold into Alabama and Mississippi and Tennessee and Arkansas and eventually to Texas. There are over 1.5 million people sold from the Piedmont and the Tidewater of Virginia and the Carolinas and Maryland, who either are shipped to New Orleans and sold from there, or they are chained together in coffles and marched from Richmond or from Charlottesville or from Raleigh or from Hagerstown, and they walk to Montgomery, Alabama, they walk to Nashville, they walk to Memphis, chained together by the dozens or even sometimes, multiple dozens of people chained together. And this was not an uncommon sight if you lived in the South, watching hundreds of people walk down the road. 20, 30, 40-year process of that is what is creating the 4 million people that will eventually be in the South when the Civil War starts.
Well, when Jim was sold, he ended up in Tennessee. And we don't actually know what happened to Jim, but we do know what happened to his son, Emmanuel. So Emmanuel was owned by Jephthah Billingsley. So in 1848, Jephthah brought Emmanuel, his wife, Elizabeth, and his then 4 sons to Texas. One of Jephthah's sons was Jesse Billingsley. He fought at the Battle of San Jacinto, and he is the one who coined the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo." And they were under his ownership at the time that they were emancipated.
Whoa, freedom. Whoa, freedom.
My great-grandfather and one of his brothers, Giles, stayed with Jesse Billingsley as a tenant farmer. They were halvers, meaning that they had to give half of whatever they made.
Now, I'll tell you a mistake. Way back in slavery time, I was standing that's when the niggas were free. How we all got every day.
And my grandfather became Jesse's right-hand man.
I can do it just as good as this house. This have 6 and 8 mules to count them going through, and boats on them count. Then they put the wagons and have boats all on them wagons.
I would say one of the most amazing artifacts we've found at Montpelier is a very small ring, red in color, it looked like a plastic ring. It was so shiny. You know, it looked like it came out of, you know, out of a little Cracker Jack box or something. And I tapped it on my teeth, and it had this brilliant, sharp feel to it. And I was like, oh my God, this isn't plastic. This is potentially stone. And I immediately took it, and I did something that Ben was like, what are you doing? I scratched the window with it, and it scratched the glass. And I was like, Ben, this is cryptocrystalline quartz. This is a carnelian bead. This is from Africa.
I think after that first generation comes over on the slave ships from Africa, they are so their culture, they've lost so much of their culture. They weren't able to bring any or very few physical remnants of their culture with them. That ring, you know, is a tiny piece of their culture that they may have been able to secrete away on the ship. And so the culture that they can bring with them is all stuff that they know in their head. So it's recipes, it's music, it's ways of praying, it's you know, the gods that they bring with them. And that first generation though gets so their culture gets so trodden out of them that you don't really see that culture reassert itself until the second or third generation. They're not allowed to practice their culture in most instances. Funerals might be an exception to that, but that the gods and the religion and the way they pray and the music, you start to see that reassert itself in a Americanized way. And by that I don't mean anything to do with the Stars and Stripes, but you know, in a way that's unique to the enslaved population of North America. And as they begin to be sold south and their families are broken up and they're removed further from their parents or their grandparents or people who were in the same villages that they were, it becomes even more fractured, and they hold on to little bits and pieces of it that you see sort of reasserting itself in a new way in this culture in the South. And you know, probably the place you see that the most is in the church services that they begin to conduct, and you know, the AME church in the South.
Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah to the Lamb. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah to the Lamb.
So after the Civil War, the name was no longer needed as a tool to find torn away loved ones. And now the name could be a source of pride. So Jim's son, Emmanuel, my great-great-grandfather, taught his children to be proud that their name had belonged to a president and to make the most of that legacy now that they had the chance. So he added to the credo, and it became, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from a president. And that was the credo for the next 2 generations until my grandfather, my beloved Gramps, who was born free. He was Emmanuel's grandson. He was proud that his father and grandfather and other enslaved ancestors had overcome enslavement. So Gramps added 2 important words, African slaves. So the credo became, always remember, you're a Madison. You come from African slaves and a president. So for the last 100 years, the credo has reminded us that we're not just descendants of a president, we're descendants of enslaved people too.
You know, while we don't have marked graves of the ancestors at Montpelier, like with tombstones with names and dates, we have found the ancestral cemetery of the enslaved Americans who lived, worked, and died at Montpelier. And we've found it all in one spot. It's one area that for years, earlier archaeologists had found these depressions in the ground. And originally it was thought there was maybe 38 to 45 graves in this one area, but we've recently done ground penetrating radar. And what we discovered is there are hundreds of graves in this location. And what it makes us realize, it's this spot that's not just down the hill from the main house is probably where any member of the enslaved community during the Madison era who passed away was buried there.
We will march through the valley in peace.
When enslaved individuals died, somewhat paradoxically, that was one of the moments where the enslaved community had the most control over their lives. So through death, they controlled their day, that ceremony, that ritual. And enslaved people didn't always have control over their daily rituals. But with funerals, most slave owners, not all, but most, did not interfere with mortuary rituals, as far as we can tell.
We will walk here together in peace.
So for an enslaved individual, when they died, whoever their close family were, hopefully were at hand. And I say hopefully because in some cases, the enslaved families had been separated over distance from sales, but your closest relatives would come to care for the body, undress the body, clean the body. This was work that was often done by women, and lay the body out. Especially in the South, you wanted to bury the body as soon as possible. Very often then, that evening, you would move to bury the body, but the funeral itself might occur days, weeks, months later, when people from different plantations and other enslaved communities were able to get word of the death and were able to travel to that plantation. And as you can imagine, all of these events that I'm saying, as if enslaved people had control of their daily lives, the reason why it worked is because these funerals, these memorials, these commemorative events were often held at night, and very often at midnight, in fact, when enslaved people, for the most part, were not in the fields working or not in the houses working and had some control over their own lives.
As I mentioned before, enslaved people were remarkable human beings who had inner strength and sense of balance and a sense of hope, and they had many talents, and they contributed mightily to this country. But I think it's important for us to remember today that when slaves died, they didn't take those qualities to the grave with them.
Oh, freedom. Whoa, freedom.
They passed them on to their descendants, including those of us alive today. So including me, including my daughter, Nicole, including my 2 grandchildren,
Justice!
one of whom is named Madison.
We don't get it!
Shut it down!
If you don't get it!
Shut it down!
And so it'd be 10 generations for Madison and Peter. But those qualities are still with them. And those qualities are still with other African Americans and the generations to come, as long as we remember our enslaved ancestors. And really, that's why the griot tradition is so important.
And another thing that I remember on the plantation that we hadn't mentioned before was the churn song. Little Emma, the baby's nurse, after the baby was tucked in bed, was often called in the kitchen to do the churning. And this is a song that she sang to the milk. Come, butter, come, Mister standing at the gate, waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Come, butter, come, Mister's a-waiting. Come, butter, come, Mister's a-waiting. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waiting. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waiting. Missus a-waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Come, butter, come, missus a-waiting. Missus a-waiting for the butter cake to come, butter, come. Missus a-waiting. Come, butter, come, the missus a-waiting. And this chant would go on through until the churning was finished, and the rich golden butter would come into a solid cake on the top of the mill.
This was an amazing journey. Thank you both for producing it, to bringing it forward for us to share in this journey with you. So I am going to ask our audience members to please place your questions in the Q&A. If you can't find it, then put it in the chat. But I want to start, Dr. Kearse, with asking you a question. When your mother gave you the box, I mean, it's not just symbolic of passing on the history. I mean, she's actually giving you a piece of history. What was contained in the box? What were your feelings at that moment? Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
Okay, so the first part of your question was what's in the box. There are all sorts of things in the boxes. There's lots and lots of pictures, but there are also land deeds, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage certificates, samples of sewing. Because one of my aunts was a great seamstress. There's insignias from service, from the armed services, personal letters, which are wonderful. Newspaper clippings. It can be anything that an ancestor or a family member could still be living once touched.
Mm-hmm. And what were
the second? Yeah. So I think the second part of your question was what it was like to receive the box. Mm-hmm. Well, first, it's an honor, but it's rather scary to have the responsibility of taking care of the box and its contents and taking care of the stories that go with those items, taking care of the history of our family. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned briefly in my remarks, I was not sure I was the right person to receive this box because I was really questioning the credo and seeing that it really did represent or speak to some of the abuses of slavery. Because after all, how did that credo come about? Mm-hmm. You're a Madison. You belong to, or you descend from African slaves and a president. And so I knew that there was rape in some form, whether it was there was any violence or, as I mentioned in the film, coercion. I knew that there was some kind of undesirable, sexual encounters between one of the most vulnerable people in the world, or more than one vulnerable people in the world, and very powerful people. Yeah. I was conflicted.
Yeah, I understand. It's I'm a historian of slavery, and when you write about these traumas, there is something that I think you know, we're all human beings. And so there is a part of the human experience. But when you find yourself, your ancestors, the kind of symbolic representations of yourself, and you're privy to uncovering these abuses, I mean, that's a hard process. And so if I can shift gears to thinking about collecting the box, right? Holding on to preserving your family's history, but also, I mean, with the film and now, you know, the book, The Other Madisons, you're sharing this story with the world. How, you know, were there any conflicts? How did you decide what to put in the book? Did you keep anything secret? I mean, how was that process of kind of writing down your family's history in an evocative, but also a provocative way?
Well, there's kind of the book has its own history. So when my mother asked me to, or instructed me actually, to write this book, she intended for me to just write down the family's stories. And for two reasons. One is she was concerned as our family got further and further away from the traumatic histories, really, of enslavement and the Jim Crow era, that we would kind of become comfortable with ourselves and forget where we had come from. The other reason was that she felt that now was the time for our story to become part of America's story, at least in our own family, for us to be able to recognize that we had a role in this country, in the history of this country. So I wrote that book. I wrote down just a straightforward family history following my mother's wishes. But I also, I'm going to skip over, I'm just going to mention one part. I also wrote it as a work of fiction, but my fiction wasn't very good. So I ended up writing this memoir. And I believe that was the right way to write this book, because it's going to give a 21st century take on, you know, the history of our ancestors and the history of slavery in this country from a very personal point of view. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's important to write it that way because it points to the fact that when we talk about slavery, when we talk about millions of people being stolen and enslaved, we tend to see them as a mass of people, but every one of those millions of people has an individual story. Mm-hmm. And it makes it personal and real, and readers can identify with it. I mean, I personally never identified with books of history, mm-hmm. talking about millions of people. I couldn't latch on to that and find myself in it. But when you take a personal look and put yourself in it, put your own feelings in it, your own interpretations, then I think it plays a different role than just learning a history. It's learning that these people were real people, mm-hmm. who had individual dreams and personalities and skills and mm-hmm. things that they enjoyed, things that they didn't like. You know, it's much more than adding up numbers or being part of a huge statistic. Mm. So did that answer your question?
It did, and it also got me to thinking about something in terms of the book. And I do have another question, but I was thinking about when you said people want to connect to the stories. I mean, this is why a lot of books written by professors of history don't sell out as much, right? Because oftentimes that personal element is taken out of it. And so you don't have people connecting with it. And so I think that this is really the brilliance of your book, but also the film, that we are taking this journey with you, which I think is really important. That also brings me to another question. You could have named the book lots of things, but you chose The Other Madisons. I get the subtitle, right? But the lost history of a president's Black family, but The Other Madisons. Tell me why that title.
You know, the title is all wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Not only is the title wrong, the subtitle is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
The title is wrong. It was, you know, that was sort of my working title.
Okay.
And when I chose that, I really didn't give it a lot of thought. But what I was sort of saying was, I thought eventually I'll change this. This is just something for me to have to work with. I was thinking that our family is not the recognized family, Madison family. We're the other ones. But the title is wrong because we're actually Madison's only direct descendants. So we are the Madisons.
Mm-hmm.
And the other reason is it's not a great title is that the Constitution uses the term other persons,
Mm-hmm.
and we're really not other persons.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we and other African Americans have played central roles
Mm-hmm.
throughout the history of this country.
Mm-hmm.
We're not other.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And we should not let ourselves be marginalized by that term, other. Now, the reason that the subtitle is wrong is because the history is not really lost.
Mm-hmm.
It has lived on through at least 8 generations.
Oh, that's right. Wow.
The publisher chose that.
Yeah. So yeah, you're like, well, you know what? So that brings me to, you know, maybe I think we may have time for 1 or 2 more questions, but you know, how are you going to, I mean, there's a book now, but how else is this history going to be shared with the newer generations who I'm sure are kind of scattered all across the United States, if not some across the world? And also because with the very first African born relative that you found, Maddie, who, if I'm getting it correct, was forced to have a child by her half brother. Is that?
Well, it was Corinne. It was Mandy's daughter who had the child.
Okay, yes. So then what about the white relatives? You know, I mean, I remember how with the Thomas Jefferson and the Hemmings and there is still some white Jeffersons who are like, he didn't father all of the children, just one. And you're like, one is too many, right? This is not a point of pride. And so how was that exchange? How do you tell this history about their direct descendant? I mean, their direct ancestor, excuse me.
I'm not sure what you mean by how I tell them. I mean,
because that's the thing, they can, the history is out here, the memoir is out here. There is no denying that this guy impregnated his half sister. They share the same father. And this is also a part of their familial story. And so I'm just wondering what has that been like? Has this happened? Or is it just kind of like 2 separate entities?
Well, I have met several members of the recognized Madison family, most of them right at Montpelier during different events. And some of them have actually thanked me, you know, for writing the book, and they call me cousin because they are happy to know, you know, the whole story. Other members of the family are certainly not so happy that I wrote the book. They're not so happy with me. But
yeah,
it's the whole story.
It's the whole story. It's the whole story. Wow. Well, let me add, I will end here with asking you, what else do you want us to take away from this history that we can apply in our lives with regard to, I think, our place as Americans, our place in these kinds of complicated familial networks. So what are your parting words for us?
Well, in the film, I do state that enslaved people were remarkable individuals, and that they passed down their remarkable qualities to those of us alive today. And that's really the most important message of the book, that African Americans should embrace their slave ancestry. And recognize that they too have qualities that enable them to endure and racism, and they enable them to put their talents to use, even in the face of racism. But the book also it doesn't really talk about it, but it illustrates that the women were just the most remarkable people imaginable. I mean, just imagine giving birth to a child and knowing that there was a good likelihood that that child would be taken away from you. And I think today about the women who lost their children through violence. They have strengths too. The founders of the Black Lives Matter movement are women.
Thank you. I think that's a powerful meditation for all of us on behalf of the Library Company in Philadelphia and the program in African American history. Jasmine Smith and I, Michael Versanti, the rest of the LCP staff, want to thank you for sharing your work with us, your story, for taking us along on this journey to learn about the Madisons. I'm not going to say the other Madisons, to learn about this branch of the Madison family and this really epic tale of a more remarkable history of enslaved people and their descendants. So thank you so much. And thank you to Eduardo, had to leave as he was on location, but thank you for producing a wonderful docu-film as well. So hopefully you all in the audience will purchase these books. Purchase this book, please. They are at a number of independent Black bookstores. If you're in the Philadelphia area, please be sure to visit those bookstores. You can also go to the website. And of course, there is always Amazon, but we want to try to go to those independent bookstores and to the press directly to support Dr. Kearse. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful night.
Okay, thank you, Deirdre, and thank you for the library companies inviting me.
You are welcome. All right, thanks.